Before we begin, there's one immediate personnel adjustment, Darren said, tapping the microphone as if checking whether it could carry the blow he was about to deliver. That was all the warning I got at 8:20 a.m., standing at the front of the operations floor with my team gathered for our weekly briefing. The air felt wrong, too tight, too expectant, like everyone already knew something I didn't. Then he said my name, Carissa Bloom. Your position is terminated, effective immediately. We're moving toward younger, faster leadership, for a heartbeat. The room didn't even blink. Dozens of faces I'd trained, defended, promoted stared straight ahead as if a fire alarm had gone off and they'd all agreed not to react. The shock hit first, sharp and disorienting. The humiliation followed, quieter, like a slow burn behind my ribs. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I simply stepped back, letting his words settle like dust on a polished surface. Darren stood confidently at the center, just 27 and already wielding authority like a new toy. His father, the CEO, had handed him the acting VP title 3 weeks ago, and he had been rehearsing moments like this ever since. To him, this wasn't a restructuring, it was a performance. We need people who can keep up, he added, smiling as if this were a motivational speech and not a public execution. No one challenged him. No one even shifted in their seat. The silence felt heavier than the announcement. I gathered my notes, keeping my expression steady even as the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Dignity had to survive the moment, even if nothing else did, back at my desk. I began packing slowly, methodically, trying not to feel every scrape of betrayal. That's when his voice floated down the hallway, careless and triumphant. I finally cleared out the old clutter. The company will run better without them. My hands paused. He thought I was clutter. He didn't realize he'd just removed the responsible officer, the single role the company legally couldn't operate without, and he had done it in front of everyone. The strange thing about being fired publicly is that the noise burns first, but the silence that follows does the real damage. By the time I stepped out of the operations floor and crossed the lobby, the humiliation had drained into something dull or numb, almost weightless, as if my body hadn't caught up to what had happened. I kept walking because stopping would have meant feeling everything at once, and I wasn't ready for that. No one called after me. No one whispered a goodbye. The glass doors slid open without resistance, releasing me into a morning that felt too bright for the kind of ending I had just walked through. The sun hit the empty parking lot in a clean, unforgiving way, flattening every shadow. It looked unfamiliar, as if the world I'd belonged to a few minutes earlier had already reshaped itself without me. For 18 years. I had walked this same concrete path in every kind of weather before dawn, after midnight, during heat waves and winter storms. It had always felt like a threshold I crossed with purpose. Now it felt like a border I'd been pushed across. I tightened my grip on the small box of my things, but the numbness throbbed underneath, spreading through my chest like cold water. My mind drifted uninvited back through the years. The first month I'd joined, when the department had been running on half-broken systems and outdated processes. The nights I'd stayed until 2 a.m, rebuilding audit protocols from scratch. The months spent negotiating better inspection cycles for vendors who didn't even understand why consistency mattered. I remembered the quiet pride of watching the company stabilize, grow, and become reliable enough for major clients to trust. I had shaped that reliability. My signature had opened doors, secured contracts, passed inspections. That history used to matter. Apparently, this morning, it didn't. I reached the security gate and forced myself to breathe. My badge was still clipped to my pocket, a small rectangle of plastic that had once defined my entire routine. I lifted it out of habit, letting it hang between my fingers, almost ready to hand it over. That's when the guard leaned slightly from his booth. "Ms. Bloom," he said quietly, glancing around as if someone might hear. "You should know they changed the access system this morning. Very early, before sunrise." I froze. the numbness sharpening into something tighter, heavier. "Changed it?" I asked. He nodded once. Slowly. It wasn't scheduled. Looked intentional. Like they were expecting something. The words hit harder than Darren's announcement had. Not because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. They hadn't decided to fire me this morning. They had planned for it, prepared for it, built the trap before walking me into it. The dull pain pulsed deeper. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Like a bruise pressed from the inside. I thanked the guard, returned the badge, and stepped beyond the gate. The doors slid shut behind me, with a soft mechanical click. The sound felt final, like the world on the other side had already forgotten I was ever part of it. "Don't comment yet. The next paragraph will make you change your mind." The numbness from the walk out of the building followed me home like a shadow I couldn't shake. I set the small box of my things on the kitchen table, but instead of unpacking it, I opened my laptop. Part of me expected the company to have already locked me out of everything, but the familiar login screen blinked to life as if nothing had happened. That alone made something tighten low in my chest, an odd, quiet suspicion. I clicked into my old inbox. At first, it was just the usual clutter vendor updates, internal memos, automated reminders. But as the messages loaded row by row, a pattern began to form, small, harmless at a glance, but unsettling when lined up together. Email after email flagged audit confirmations, inspection schedules, compliance reports needing certification. All of them had my name assigned next to one field-authorized responsible officer. A faint prickle crept across the back of my neck. Of course I knew my title. I'd held it for years. But seeing it repeated this many times, seeing how many processes required my explicit approval, made something click in a way it never had before. I had been the one who signed off on safety audits, environmental compliance, risk assessments, vendor certifications. Those signatures weren't ceremonial. They were binding. Without them, the company couldn't legally operate past certain checkpoints. Darren, in all his confidence, hadn't mentioned any of that. I opened the compliance folder I kept on my desktop. Inside was every regulatory file I'd curated across nearly 2 decades organizing, updating, cross-checking. I scrolled through the documents slowly, and with each scroll, the faint prickle turned sharper, almost electric. Every operational certification the company held listed me as the responsible officer of record. Every renewal required my acknowledgement. Every vendor audit required my sign-off. And every one of them was still active under my name. A strange clarity washed through me. Not vindication, not satisfaction, just awareness. Pure, cold, undeniable awareness. If they wanted to replace me, there was a process, a formal transition. 3 steps. Verified by legal. A checklist every executive knew existed, even if they'd never seen it up close. Transfers of responsibility weren't handed off like meeting notes. They required approvals, filings, notifications to regulators. I clicked into the legal correspondence folder, something I rarely needed unless an audit escalated or a client demanded full documentation. The folder opened with a long list of threads, most uneventful, but buried near the bottom was one email that didn't look familiar. It was from 9 months ago. Subject personnel contingency, required signatures. My pulse thudded once. Heavy. The message was from the company's internal counsel. Short, direct. If there is any anticipated restructuring of departmental leadership, please secure Ms. Desiarissei, Bloom's formal signature on the transfer of responsibility form. Her authorization remains the primary legal anchor for operational compliance. Below it, a second line, pending. Please confirm once completed. There was no reply, no follow-up, no attachment showing the process had ever been completed. The prickling sensation that had been hovering at the edge of my awareness surged sharp, undeniable, crawling right beneath my skin. They never processed the transfer. They had planned the firing. They had even changed the access system before sunrise. But the single most important step, the one that allowed them to legally replace me, had been forgotten. A slow breath left my chest, trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the realization settling in with quiet finality. They had fired me, but on paper, on every legal document that governed their operation, I was still the one holding the responsibility they couldn't function without. And that mistake wasn't small, it was catastrophic, and it was theirs. If you think you understand, the next paragraph will change your mind. I sat at my kitchen table for a long moment after reading that 9-month-old email, letting the implications settle the way dust settles over furniture when a house has been left too quiet. Shock had already had its time. So had the hurt. What remained now was something steadier and almost surgical clarity. If I wanted answers, I needed to stop reacting emotionally and start looking at the entire operational structure the same way I'd approached every audit for the last 18 years, piece by piece, system by system. So I opened the compliance dashboard, the homepage loaded with a familiar grid of modules: vendor safety, environmental integrity, operational continuity, quality assurance, logistics verification, all of it mapped to deadlines, supervision requirements, and the roles responsible for enforcement. My name was everywhere, not as an employee, not as a supervisor, but as the authorized responsible officer, the legally accountable signature for every inch of the company's supply chain. I clicked into the vendor matrix first. 22 suppliers, 22 separate lines of dependency, and beside each one, in the field labeled Compliance Authority, was my name, not a title, my actual name. The more I scrolled, the colder the realization became. These vendors didn't merely prefer my oversight, they were required by regulation to operate under a certified responsible officer. If I withdrew from that position, they couldn't legally continue supplying the company until a new officer was vetted, approved, and registered. And that process didn't happen in an afternoon. It didn't even happen in a week. It could take months. My fingertips hovered above the keyboard as the strategic shape of the situation emerged with clean, sharp lines. Darren thought he'd removed an outdated employee. What he had actually removed without replacing was the operational backbone that all these vendors relied on to stay compliant. If I stepped away formally, the dominoes wouldn't just fall, they would collapse in perfect sequence before acting on anything. I opened the operational contracts, not the employee contracts, not the hidden clauses Darren probably imagined he understood, but the regulatory agreements every company in our industry lived or died by. The language was dry, bureaucratic, painfully literal. Continuity of certified oversight is mandatory. Any lapse in responsible officer supervision automatically voids the operational clearance of associated vendors. Translated, if I wasn't there, they couldn't be there. And if they couldn't be there, the company couldn't run. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't revenge. This was the rulebook Darren should have read before playing commander. I leaned back, breathing slowly, feeling the sharpness of the moment settle into focus. I wasn't looking to hurt anyone. I wasn't planning to pull any trigger. I was simply acknowledging a fact Darren had refused to consider. You can't fire the person who holds the keys to the legal infrastructure and expect the machine to keep running. A vibration buzzed against the table. My phone. I expected a friend checking on me, or maybe an automated notification. Instead, I saw the name of one of our largest vendors, Northern Tier Safety and Supply. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with understanding. The message was short. We heard you left the company. Does this affect our certification status? I stared at the screen, the edges of the text almost too sharp. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask what happened. They asked the only question that mattered for their survival. And they already understood the answer. I typed back carefully, choosing every word with the precision of someone who had signed thousands of documents and knew exactly what each line meant. I can't speak on behalf of the company anymore. But yes, my departure impacts the certification tied to my oversight, within minutes. Another message arrived, not from them this time, but from a second vendor, then a third. Word was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. I exhaled slowly, letting the clarity settle fully. They knew. The vendors understood my role more clearly than the company ever had. And the moment I officially withdrew, the first domino would fall. Most people stop here, but the truth lies in the next part. The moment I finished reading the vendor messages, a quiet resolve settled over me, not explosive, not heated, but precise. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't hurting. I wasn't even angry. I was simply stepping into the role I had carried silently for years, the person who made hard decisions before anyone else realized. And this one was, I opened a blank document and began drafting the only statement that mattered now. Notice of withdrawal of responsible party. The title alone carried weight: formal, procedural, and entirely within my rights. My hands didn't shake as I typed. In fact, they felt steadier than they had all morning. This wasn't retaliation. It wasn't revenge. It was compliance, pure and simple. I included every detail required by regulation: my full name, certification number, dates of oversight, attached documentation of my role, and an official declaration that I was removing myself from all operational responsibility effective immediately. I reviewed it twice, then a third time, not out of doubt, but out of habit. When you spend 18 years ensuring nothing slips through the cracks, precision becomes instinct. Once I was sure every line was exact, I exported the document as a signed PDF. A strange calm flowed through me, like closing a file drawer after years of keeping it open. Then I built the email list. First, State Office of Occupational Safety, the agency responsible for validating responsible officer oversight. Second, Department of Quality and Standards, the governing body for environmental compliance and vendor certifications. Third, 12 primary suppliers, all of whom depended on my authorization to ship legally. Fourth, 3 logistics partners, whose transport clearances hinged on my active status. I attached the notice to each message. No commentary, no emotion, just procedures being followed the way they were designed. When everything was ready, I hovered over the send button not out of hesitation, but as a final act of acknowledgement. Once this went out, the system I had helped build would begin shutting down piece by piece, not because I wanted it to, but because the rules left no other outcome. I clicked Send All. A small whoosh sound chimed from my laptop, soft and unremarkable, completely disproportionate to the impact it would trigger. The room grew still again, but this time the silence didn't hurt. It felt earned, controlled. I expected the responses to take time. Bureaucracy usually moved slowly, but within 90 seconds. My phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then a third time. The first reply came from Hayden Industrial Supply, one of our longest-running partners. The message was short, professional, and stunningly direct. Thank you. Carissa, per state regulations, we are required to freeze all outgoing shipments until a certified replacement is documented. Please inform your leadership. I exhaled, steady and measured. It had begun. A second message arrived 2 minutes later, this time from a logistics carrier. Acknowledged. Routing paused until new responsible officer is approved by oversight agencies. No drama, no outrage, just the machinery of compliance clicking into place. A third email chimed, then a fourth, vendors confirming receipt, partners flagging disruption protocols, agencies issuing automatic acknowledgments. Every notification was another domino tipping forward, each one falling exactly as the regulations dictated. And somewhere across the city, inside the building I had walked out of just hours earlier, Darren and the leadership team remained blissfully unaware that the collapse had already started. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now. What they didn't understand was simple. Firing me hadn't changed the system. It had only removed the person who held it together. And once that person formally stepped away, the laws they ignored began doing what they were written to do. I closed my laptop gently, feeling the weight of the moment settle, but not heavily, not painfully, decisively. The next part is only understood by the truly observant. Don't miss it. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I was already awake far earlier than usual, yet strangely calm. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even curious. I simply sat at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, waiting for the inevitable. They had fired the responsible officer. I had withdrawn legally, and the system, which didn't care about pride or politics, was about to remind them how unforgiving compliance could be. The first notification arrived at 7:03 a.m. Shipment suspended, pending updated oversight documentation. Vendor number 1. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of my mouth. Not joy, not revenge, just the quiet amusement of someone watching a very predictable equation unfold exactly as written. 5 minutes later came the second message, then the third. By 7:20, all 5 major suppliers had emailed the operations inbox. Apparently, the shared one still had me on the CC list. Each message said the same thing in different fonts. No responsible officer, no shipments. I took another sip of coffee, smooth, dark, a little too bitter, but fitting for the moment. I pictured the operations floor, the frantic blinking of status boards, the sudden red flags, the uncomfortable silence when staff realized they couldn't blame this on a software bug. I imagined Darren stumbling into his new VP role, still half asleep and fully unprepared, holding a coffee he didn't deserve. Almost on cue, my phone buzzed. A group message, likely created in a panic, pinged at the top of my screen. Who signed off on the overnight compliance freeze? Why are vendors halting shipments? Can someone contact Carissa? I let out a soft laugh. Contact me. Now another notification chimed. This one wasn't a vendor. It was one of our largest clients. A name I recognized instantly, Stonebridge Medical Logistics, a company that made decisions slowly, carefully, and only after reviewing every risk factor twice. Their email, too, had landed in the shared inbox, another leftover from years of being the point person. Before continuing with our quarterly renewal, please confirm the name and certification number of the current responsible officer overseeing your supply chain. I could almost hear the tone behind the message, professional, measured, but edged with suspicion. Clients like Stonebridge didn't ask questions without reason, and they especially didn't like surprises. I set my cup down, fingers tapping lightly against the counter. Somewhere inside the building I used to walk into every day, someone was sweating, and that someone was probably Darren. The next wave of messages came faster. The digital equivalent of cracks traveling through ice, internal alerts, escalation notices, frantic meeting invites. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The subject lines told the story well enough. Then came the moment I hadn't expected, but deeply appreciated. A new email appeared, sent from the COO, but addressed to Darren. Except the COO had also accidentally sent it to me. I clicked Darren. She withdrew from the file. That means, we are not legally permitted to operate. I read the line twice, then leaned back in my chair, feeling a dry, cold amusement settle in my chest. Not vindictive, not triumphant, just accurate. They finally understood. 5 minutes later, another message followed. Who authorized terminating her before securing a replacement? I didn't need to see the responses to guess the chaos that followed. Darren would blame HR. HR would blame the legal department. Legal would blame operations. And operations would stare at each other, wondering how anyone could have overlooked the most critical piece of their entire infrastructure. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, less bitter this time, and looked out the window at the quiet street. Somewhere across the city, alarms were going off inside a building that once thought of me as old clutter. Now they were discovering what clutter prevented collapse. The first cracks had formed, and they weren't cracks, really. They were fractures, clean, inevitable, and spreading fast. By mid-morning, the frantic emails had slowed, not because the crisis had passed, but because the people sending them had run out of explanations. When compliance systems fail, panic comes first, confusion follows, but eventually, the silence begins heavy, resigned, and threaded with the realization that something bigger is about to hit. That moment arrived at 10:41 a.m. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't immediately recognize. Government prefix. State-level exchange. It was the kind of incoming call you only get when something is already burning. I let it ring twice before answering. Ms. Bloom, this is Inspector Hale with the State Office of Operational Safety. Are you available to speak for a moment regarding your former company's compliance records? His tone was calm, professional, but unmistakably urgent. I stepped into my living room, lowering my voice out of instinct. I can speak briefly, I said. What's the issue? There seems to be a discrepancy, he replied. Your name is still listed as the responsible officer in the state registry. But the company just notified us of a leadership restructuring. They haven't filed a transfer form. And their representative, Mr. Darren Cale, could not explain why. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to, Inspector Hale continued, as if filling the silence himself. When we asked who managed the last 3 audit cycles, Mr. Cale didn't seem aware there were 3 cycles. Hale said, "That's unusual." A slow, measured breath left my chest. Not amusement, not satisfaction. More like a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. The people who fired me had no idea how anything actually worked. What exactly do you need from me? I asked. We need to confirm your withdrawal, he said. We received your notice this morning, but because your name has been attached to these certifications for years, we must verify identity and intent. You understand the sensitivity? Yes, I said simply, I do. He paused, then added, and we'll need to speak with the company again. Their operations director attempted to answer our follow-up questions, but her responses contradicted the compliance history. A small, controlled flicker of cold irony moved through me. Of course they contradicted it. I had been the one writing that history for nearly 2 decades. What did they ask? I said. Who authored the last environmental report? Who approved the vendor renewals? Who signed the risk assessments for the medical clients? Each time, they gave a different name. None of them matched the record. I felt the shift in his tone, then subtle. But there, he wasn't just investigating. He was losing patience. Ms. Bloom, he said finally, we'll need to arrange a time to verify your documentation. You're the only individual who has ever been listed as responsible officer for their supply chain. Without your confirmation, we can't approve any emergency reassignment. There it was, the quiet power settling into place. Not loud, not triumphant, just factual. I'll make myself available, I answered. Thank you. We'll also inform the company that until a replacement is certified, they are not permitted to operate under state law. I believe they misunderstood the severity of the situation. Misunderstood was a generous word. After we ended the call, I stood still for a long moment, letting the weight of it sink in, not fear, not guilt, but a sober acknowledgement of authority I hadn't realized still carried so much force. Within minutes, my inbox buzzed with a new message from Director Janice Rowe, Compliance Affairs subject. Urgent, please contact us. Immediately, I opened it. Carissa, the state inspector is requesting direct communication with you. We need you to confirm your withdrawal and assist with clarifying historical compliance records. Can you speak with us today? Translation. They needed the person they had erased, and not for sentiment, apology, or courtesy, for survival. I closed the email slowly, my expression steady. The audit storm had arrived, and I was the only one who could navigate it. The call came sooner than I expected, though not sooner than I knew it would. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter at 1:14 p.m. The company's caller ID flashing across the screen like a warning label. For a moment, I simply watched it ring, letting the sound fill the room. No rush, no tension, just a quiet, detached curiosity about which executive would finally swallow their pride. when I answered. It wasn't the COO. It wasn't HR. It was the CEO himself, Graham Cale. His voice, usually polished and confident, carried a tightness that didn't belong to a man in control. "Carissa," he said, skipping every pleasantry he'd ever used in 18 years. "We need you to come back. Temporarily." The word temporarily was supposed to soften the request, make it sound reasonable, procedural. It didn't. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the quiet street outside my window. My tone remained steady cool. I can't return," I said. "I've already submitted my notice of withdrawal. The agencies have it." He exhaled sharply, the sound trembling at the edges. "Yes, we saw that," he said. "And the vendors saw it. And now the state inspector is." He stopped, regrouped, then tried again. "Look, the department is in a tough spot. The team needs guidance. Guidance." That was one way to describe the gaping hole in their operations. I kept my voice level. "Your acting VP should be providing that." Silence. A silence so long I almost pictured him rubbing his forehead in frustration. "Carissa, you know Darren is new to this. He isn't familiar with the audit cycles, or the regulatory framework, or the compliance infrastructure," I offered gently. Another silence. This one heavier. "Yes," he admitted. "That. Exactly that." I let the words echo for a beat before responding. "I understand the situation, but the notice was filed correctly, legally. I no longer have authority to step into any operational role. It wasn't anger. It wasn't spite. Just fact." He swallowed audibly. "Then advise us. Help us navigate this. Tell us what we need to fix." For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him but sympathy wasn't part of this equation anymore. "I can't advise you in any official capacity," I said. "I'm not attached to your compliance records anymore. And as of this morning, the state is reviewing your status." He inhaled sharply. "Reviewing right on cue." Another buzz hit my phone, an email notification. I glanced down. Inspector Hale had just sent a new message. "Temporary suspension of operational clearance, recommended 72 hours. I didn't open the email yet. I didn't need to. The subject line told the entire story. "Graham," I said evenly, "you should check your inbox." The pause that followed wasn't silent. It was suffocating. He must have opened it. He must have read it. Because when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a hoarse whisper. "They're suspending us for 72 hours. There it was. The inevitability I had foreseen the moment Darren announced my termination. "Until a new responsible officer is certified," I reminded him, my tone cool but not cruel. "The state cannot allow your vendors to operate under your name. It's a compliance lock. You know that?" Footsteps echoed faintly on his end, hurried. Panicked? Papers rustled. Voices rose in the background. Someone asked, "What does suspension mean for outgoing shipments?" Someone else said, "We can't halt production again." The CEO tried to steady his voice. "Carissa, is there any way to reverse this?" Any way at all, I considered his question, with the same patience I'd applied to every audit, every risk assessment, every crisis I'd prevented quietly over the years. "No," I said. "The process has to run its course. Not because I wanted it to, but because the law demanded it, and because they had removed the only person who understood how the system actually worked." As he fumbled for words, I let the tension settle, cold and precise. The call they had feared had finally arrived, and I was no longer part of their solution. I was simply the boundary they had crossed, by the time afternoon light stretched across my living room floor. The company was already slipping into a kind of operational blackout. I didn't need to be there to know it. Every new notification flooding the shared inbox told the story with chilling precision. What began as cracks had become fractures, and now, the structure was giving way. The first major indicator came at 2:16 p.m. When the logistics board posted a full route freeze, all outgoing transport, suspended pending responsible officer approval, that message alone would have been enough to choke the company for days. But 20 minutes later, a second alert hit, then a third. Within an hour, the entire supply chain had frozen solid, a perfect gridlock of halted shipments, stalled inspections, and vendors legally barred from moving even a single unit on the company's behalf. It wasn't chaos, not yet. Chaos implied motion. This was paralysis, and paralysis is always worse. I imagined the operations floor screens flashing red, alarms chiming, project managers scrambling through documentation they barely understood. And somewhere in the middle of that, Darren panicked. Defensive, trying to bluff his way through systems built long before he'd ever set foot in the company. At 3:07 p.m., another email appeared, the kind that shifts a crisis into catastrophe. Effective immediately. Stonebridge Medical Logistics suspends our contract pending verification of compliant operational oversight. Stonebridge was one of the top 3 clients. 5 minutes later, the second major client followed, at 3:29 p.m. The third client sent their notice. All 3 messages used the same phrasing, the same legal tone, the same implication: no responsible officer, no contract. The tension inside me tightened, not fear, not guilt, but something sharper. A harsh, metallic awareness of what 18 years of responsibility truly meant, and what firing that responsibility meant for them. A 4th notification appeared, then a 5th, then 12 more in succession: escalation reports, loss projections, risk signals. I didn't open them. At 3:46 p.m., my phone buzzed again, not with an email, but with a voicemail transcription from a number I didn't recognize. The first line read, "Where is Darren? Someone needs to explain this to the board." I almost felt a cold, humorless laugh rise in my chest. The board hadn't even begun to understand what was coming. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:02 p.m., a new message arrived, this time not from a client or a logistics carrier, but from one of our most compliance-obsessed suppliers. The subject line was simple: operational qualification status. I opened it. To leadership with the departure of Ms. Carissa Bloom. Your organization no longer meets the minimum oversight standards required for certified operation under state and federal regulations. Effective immediately, your company is considered non-operational until a new certified responsible officer is approved and documented. This notice is mandatory. The words hit with a blunt, irreversible finality. This wasn't a pause. This wasn't a warning. This was a declaration the company could not operate. At all. I leaned back in my chair, letting the meaning settle like a stone dropping into deep water. There was no satisfaction, not the warm kind. Anyway, but there was a cold, precise understanding of consequences. I had spent years protecting them from exactly this, and now, deprived of that protection. The system was applying pressure the only way it knew how: directly, ruthlessly, and without negotiation. I could almost visualize the boardroom papers scattered, executives shouting over each other, Darren shrinking under the weight of questions he couldn't answer. The CEO's expression twisting from disbelief to horror to fury, not at me, though I'm sure he'd try, but at the realization that Darren's impulsiveness hadn't just bruised the company, it had gutted it. And when the board finally saw the supplier's notice, and they would, any minute now, they would understand the one thing none of them had bothered to consider: the foundations they stood on were ones I had built. And Darren had torn them out with a single careless decision. The collapse wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The message came through at 6:08 p.m. Long after the company should have been winding down for the day. Emergency board meeting initiated. Mandatory attendance. I wasn't invited. Of course. But that didn't matter. I knew exactly what room they were gathering in, exactly what screens were flashing red behind them, and exactly whose name they were about to say in tones they'd never used before. The collapse had pushed them to the edge. Now they were about to acknowledge the drop. Later, a friend inside the company, Someone who still had a conscience described the scene to me in fragments. I pieced it together easily. The boardroom was packed, the tension thick enough to mute the hum of the air vents. A dozen executives and directors sat around the long table, each with a stack of documents, audit alerts, and vendor notices in front of them. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone looked older than they had that morning. And then Darren walked in. He tried to look composed, but the shake in his hands gave him away. His tie was crooked, his posture deflated. The confidence that once dripped off him in every meeting had evaporated. The CEO, his father, didn't offer a greeting. "What?" he said, voice low and cracking. "Have you done?" The silence that followed was brutal. Darren opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like he was waiting for someone else to give him the words. No one did. Instead, HR slid a folder across the table. "Before we go any further," she said tightly, "there is something the board needs to understand." She flipped the first page. 9 months ago, legal notified your department that in the event of restructuring, we would need a formal transfer of responsible officer authority from Ms. Bloom. She tapped the line with her pen. "You were copied on that notice." "Darren," he blinked, confused, defensive. "That wasn't important. I thought it was just paperwork." The COO's fist hit the table so hard the pens rattled. "Not important," he snapped. "This paperwork is why every vendor froze operations today. It's why we're losing contracts. It's why the state suspended us." One of the board members turned the page. "And according to the compliance records," she added, "Carissa Bloom is still the only authorized responsible officer of this company." The room shifted. An almost physical recoil. Another board member spoke next, older, sharper in tone. "So when you fired her without securing a transfer, you effectively stripped this company of its legal status to operate. Correct?" The legal director nodded grimly. "Correct." The CEO stared at his son, not angry, not disappointed, but hollow, as if trying to absorb the scale of the damage. "You fired," he said slowly. "The one person we legally cannot function without." Darren tried to defend himself. I thought we needed younger leadership, innovation, change. You needed competence," someone muttered. Then came the moment, the one that would be replayed in whispers for years. The board chair leaned forward. Voice flat, "Darren, your decision has rendered this entire company operationally void." Operationally void. 2 words more devastating than any insult. Darren's face drained of color. Sweat gathered at his hairline. His jaw clenched, then trembled. He looked around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "There must be a workaround," he said desperately. "There isn't," the legal director replied. "Not without Carissa." The CEO's voice cracked. "She won't come back." He was right, and they all knew it. The boardroom fell into a suffocating stillness, wide-eyed, white-knuckled, confronted by a truth they had never considered. The entire infrastructure they depended on existed because I'd held it together quietly, competently, invisibly. They had mistaken quiet for replaceable, experience for clutter, authority for background noise, and Darren Young, reckless, incurious, had pulled out the wrong pillar. The reveal was complete, in the end. It wasn't anger that hit him. It wasn't humiliation. It was recognition. Cold, simple, devastating recognition. Everything had collapsed because of him. I didn't expect the board to contact me that same evening, but desperation has a way of speeding up corporate timelines. At 7:23 p.m., just as I sat down with a warm mug of tea, my phone lit up with the subject line, "Formal request for immediate consultation urgent." I opened it slowly, savoring the quiet of my living room, the stillness, the ownership of my space, the gentle hum of peace that had been absent for so long. Inside the email was a single sentence: "Carissa, the board is requesting your presence tonight to discuss reinstatement." Reinstatement. The word alone almost made me laugh, not bitterly, but with a kind of long-delayed relief. an emotional exhale I'd been holding since the moment Darren spoke my name in front of the operations department. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I took a sip of tea, tasting every bit of calm I had earned. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. This time, the caller ID displayed the board chair's name. "Carissa," she said, skipping introductions. "We want you to return to the company, effective immediately, with a new compensation package." Her voice strained, as if she were forcing each word through a wall of pride. "What kind of package?" I asked evenly. "A 50% salary increase, full executive privileges, and authority to restructure the compliance division as you see fit." For a moment, I closed my eyes, not out of temptation, but out of something like closure, recognizing that the power they tried to strip from me had never actually belonged to them. "I appreciate the offer," I said calmly, "but I'm not interested." Silence, then confusion. "You what, Carissa? We need you. The company needs you. Need." They had never used that word before. "Not for me." "I understand," I replied. "But your organization made its position clear when Darren was allowed to speak for it." A soft, stunned breath came through the line. "Carissa, please reconsider." I didn't rush my answer. I let the weight of choice sink in my choice, not theirs. For the first time in years, I wasn't speaking as an employee, or as a subordinate, or as a placeholder for responsibility others took credit for. I was speaking as myself. "If I come back," I said slowly, "it will not be as an employee." The board chair paused, uncertain. "Then, in what capacity?" "As an independent consultant. I will advise, I will oversee compliance, but I will not report to Darren, HR, or the executive team. My terms, my hours, my authority." It felt good saying it clean, decisive, freeing, like removing chains I never realized were wrapped around me. She hesitated only a second. "If that's what it takes, the board will consider it. But we need your responsible officer certification active again. Then I need assurances." I said, "Not verbal ones. We can put them in writing," she replied quickly. I believed her. Desperation is a powerful negotiator. But before I could respond, another call buzzed through another board member, this one representing one of the company's largest investors. I switched lines. "Ms. Bloom?" he said without preamble. "I'm calling because our firm will not continue funding the company unless you are reinstated as the responsible officer. That's the board's decision." I replied, "They're working through it now." "No," he said, voice dropping. "There's more." I sat up straighter. "We reviewed the series of failures today. We reviewed who authorized what, and we reviewed the internal timelines." A pause. "Our firm will only release capital if you return under independent status, and if Graham Cale and his son are removed from leadership." I didn't speak, not yet. I let the words settle like warm light spreading across a cold room. "Carissa," he continued, "you built the compliance integrity of that company. Without you, it can't function. Without you, we can't trust it." Shock wasn't the word. Satisfaction wasn't either. What I felt was deeper, a release of a pressure I had carried for years, a kind of justice that didn't roar, didn't gloat, but settled with quiet. Undeniable truth. "Do you accept our terms?" he asked. "I do," I answered. When I returned to the board chair's line, she sounded rattled. She already knew what the investor had said. "Carissa, the board agrees. Graham and Darren will step down." I closed my eyes, letting the relief wash through me. Not revenge, not triumph, just the profound easing of a weight finally lifted. "Then I will return," I said gently. "As an independent consultant, freedom, authority, equilibrium restored. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like a fight, it felt like oxygen." The announcement came 3 days later, tucked inside a formal company press release that made its way across every industry newsletter and social channel I subscribed to. I didn't have to read far, just the first sentence was enough. The board has voted to remove Graham Cale as CEO and dissolve the acting VP appointment previously held by Darren Cale. There it was, the shift that had been building beneath the company's feet finally settling into place. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, leadership had changed not because of a merger, or an acquisition, or a strategic pivot, but because the company had finally been forced to face the consequences of ignoring the people who actually kept it standing. A new interim CEO was appointed. A new compliance committee was formed, one I had no interest in joining. And the name Cale quietly vanished from the organizational chart like a stain someone had scrubbed away in the middle of the night. And me, I wasn't part of the company anymore. Not in the way I had been, but I was more essential than ever. I signed the independent consultant contract the following afternoon. It was refreshingly short, no unnecessary clauses, no subtle traps, no corporate ego disguised as policy, just clear language acknowledging my authority and independence. I would work by the hour. I would oversee from the outside. I would choose which projects mattered and which didn't. And if I ever felt the arrangement no longer aligned with my values, I could walk away without consequence. After 18 years of giving them every piece of myself, the freedom was almost startling. The first meeting with the new leadership team happened over video. They were respectful, prepared, and most importantly, humble. They listened. They took notes. They asked questions that revealed genuine curiosity, not forced performance. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting upstream. I felt like I was finally being seen. As for Darren, the industry moved faster than he did. Word of the meltdown spread quickly, dripping into competitor circles and investor groups like a cautionary tale. 3 weeks after the board removed him, unofficial reports surfaced that he had withdrawn from the sector entirely. A career that had been handed to him like a gift had dissolved just as easily, all because he never bothered to understand the foundation he stood on. There was no satisfaction in knowing this, just a quiet acknowledgement of balance restored. But the real twist, the one that lingered in my mind long after the chaos had settled, came on a calm Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, tea steeping beside me, reviewing the new compliance roadmap for the company I now advised. The sun streamed through the window, warming the wood beneath my palms, and a peaceful weight settled in my chest, the kind of calm that feels earned, not given. Then my phone buzzed. The number wasn't familiar, but the company name in the email signature made my eyebrows lift. Northwell Logistics Group, one of the largest, fastest-growing players in the industry, a competitor whose reputation had always impressed me from afar. Their message was concise, Ms. Bloom. Your leadership stability and compliance integrity during the recent industry event did not go unnoticed. If you ever wish to shift your certification, we would welcome you as our responsible officer. You don't need to stand for them. Stand for us. I read the message twice, feeling something warm and quietly triumphant rise inside me. Not arrogance, not revenge, but possibility. Pure and bright. It wasn't about choosing between companies. It was about choosing myself. A new beginning didn't always start with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it began with a quiet invitation, a door opening where another had slammed shut. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I stepped outside, letting the late morning sunlight wash over me. The air felt crisp, clear, and open, as if the world had widened without me noticing. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the sense of freedom that came not from victory, but from release. I wasn't the woman who had walked out of that company in silence. I wasn't the woman who had packed her things with shaking hands. I wasn't even the woman who had sent the notice of withdrawal. I was someone rebuilt steady, renewed, unburdened. When I opened my eyes again, the sunlight felt like a spotlight I hadn't asked for, but one I finally felt worthy of. And as I took that first step forward, the path didn't just look open, it looked mine. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this stability built quietly can shatter loudly when taken for granted. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply reclaiming your own freedom. Tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. And where are you listening from tonight? If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, hit like, share this video with someone who needs strength today. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your presence here means more than you know.